Imagine the year is 1862. You're trekking through the lowlands of Veracruz, Mexico. Think Louisiana bayou heat, but thicker. The air is heavy. The mosquitoes are loud. The jungle feels like a green wall you could lean on. Suddenly, your guide stops. He points down into the mud. It isn't a rock. It isn't a tree stump. It is a face. A colossal stone head, taller than a grown man, carved from a single block of volcanic basalt. It weighs more than 20 tons. The face stares back at you, calm, almost patient. Thick lips, a broad nose, a strange helmet. For the early explorers, it felt impossible. There were no quarries nearby. The nearest basalt sources were dozens of miles away, and whoever made this had no wheels, no horses, no iron tools. So the questions came fast. Who were they? How did they move this thing? And why does it look so unfamiliar to a 19th century mind? For decades, scholars tried to force an answer that made them comfortable. Some said Maya. Others went bigger: Africa, Egypt, lost travelers. It was a classic case of people seeing what they expected to see. They were wrong. Long before the Aztecs built their temples, long before the Maya became the star of the history books, another culture was already shaping this region. They worked rubber like we work plastic. They played a brutal ball game with a solid rubber sphere. They raised monuments out of mud and stone. And then, somehow, the story went quiet. Today, we're going to peel back about 3,000 years. We'll treat it like a cold case. We'll follow the clues. We'll look at dates, bones, monuments, and the science that finally closed the argument. Welcome to the mystery of the rubber people. The Gulf Coast lowlands have a way of swallowing sound, and in that damp hush, the jungle seems to eat your footsteps while the air presses down like a wet blanket until even your thoughts feel slower. In a place like that, history doesn't feel like marble columns and clean museum glass. It feels like mud and heat, like you're stepping into something that does not care whether you understand it or not. In 1862, a Mexican scholar and explorer named José Melgar y Serrano moved through this landscape near Tres Zapotes, not looking for a revolution in American history, but for the kinds of ruins a serious man of his era would recognize, the kinds of stories that already had names. Then the ground offered him something else, a face. Not a little mask, not a broken figurine, but a colossal head carved from volcanic basalt, taller than a grown man and heavy enough to make your stomach drop when someone tells you the number. Over 20 tons for some of these monuments. The head looked back with a calm that felt almost insulting, as if it hadn't struggled to be made at all, as if it had always been there. And in that instant, before any textbooks, before any theories, before any arguments, the real mystery was physical. How did a single block of basalt become this, and how did it end up here? Because the stone itself is a clue. Basalt does not belong to the soft, watery lowlands, and the nearest major sources are in the Tuxtla Mountains, which can mean moving stone something like 60 miles, around 100 kilometers, depending on the monument and the route. And the route is not kind. You are not crossing a friendly prairie. You are moving through wetlands, dealing with rivers that flood and shift, dealing with ground that turns to soup, dealing with heat that makes work feel twice as hard. So the head becomes a question you can't laugh off, because someone had the muscle, and someone had the plan, and someone had the authority to make thousands of hours of labor happen in the same direction. Yet Melgar did what humans do when the world breaks their categories. He tried to fix it with the categories he had, and the 19th century had some pretty dangerous ones. It was an era that treated the old world like the only real source of greatness, and it was an era that doubted what indigenous Americans could build. So Melgar described the face using comparisons that would later echo for over a century. He suggested Ethiopian or Egyptian features. And that phrase matters because it is not evidence of Africans in ancient Mexico. It is evidence of the 1800s looking at a monument and trying to make it fit a worldview. It's a mirror held up to the observer. And here is the part that always gets missed. Even if you never talk about faces again, the monument still forces the same conclusion. This was organized society, specialized skill, political power strong enough to reshape a landscape. In other words, the real story was never in the nose or the lips. It was in the logistics, in the time and labor hidden inside the stone. That is where the Olmecs begin to emerge, not as a name yet, and not as a chapter in a book, but as a presence you can feel. Still, for decades, the presence stayed blurry. Archaeology was young, timelines were shaky, and scholars had gaps everywhere. When people found something monumental in Mesoamerica, they often reached for the most famous label available: Maya. The Maya were the brand name. The Maya had grand ruins that outsiders had already romanticized, and they had writing carved into stone, so they fit the expectation of what a civilization should look like. So when explorers and archaeologists went into the Gulf Coast region and saw mounds and carved monuments, they leaned toward the Maya explanation, and it was an easy box to put things in, even as it kept the truth from breathing. In 1925, Franz Blom and his colleagues traveled to Venta, saw a carefully arranged ceremonial landscape, saw earthworks rising out of the flat lowlands, saw carved stones that seemed to speak in symbols, and classified the ruins as Maya. That decision sounds like a detail, but it wasn't, because it shaped what questions were allowed. If Venta was Maya, then the Gulf Coast was not the main stage, but a side stage, and the stone heads were odd, but not revolutionary. And no one had to imagine a powerful society thriving here earlier than the Maya story everyone thought they knew. This is how history can disappear in plain sight, not because the evidence is gone, but because the frame is wrong. Then the 1930s arrive. Archaeology becomes more systematic, fieldwork gets sharper, and a new kind of confidence enters the discipline. Not the confidence of speculation, but the confidence of measuring and documenting and refusing to stop at the first convenient answer. That is why Matthew Stirling comes in. Stirling was not the kind of person to tiptoe around sacred cows, and as he excavated, recorded, and compared, he looked at the Gulf Coast monuments and saw a style that didn't behave like Maya art. He saw themes that kept repeating: jaguars, infants with strange expressions, rulers emerging from openings like caves or mouths, bodies posed like they were mid-transformation, and a symbolic language that felt older than the elegant classic Maya world people were used to. And he asked the question that changes everything. What if the Gulf Coast isn't borrowing from the Maya, and what if the Maya are inheriting something from here? The question is simple, but it's explosive because it flips the timeline and the emotional hierarchy too, suggesting the famous civilization might not be the first chapter, that the star might have had teachers. Stirling needed more than style to make that argument stick. Style is persuasive, but it can be fought over, and two experts can look at the same carving and come away with different dates. So archaeology needed something that could pin the story down, something that could force a calendar onto a debate. That is why one monument became so important: Stela C. It carries a long count date, and under common correlations used by many researchers, that date lines up around 31 BCE. You don't have to become a specialist in Mesoamerican calendars to feel what that does to the room. It pushes complex monument making back in time, suggests deep roots, and hints that writing-like systems and calendrical thinking might not be exclusive to the Maya narrative people loved. Scholars argued, of course. Some questioned the reading, some questioned the correlation, some treated it as an outlier, and that is fair, because a single artifact should not become a religion. But even with the skepticism, the direction of travel had changed. The Gulf Coast was no longer a footnote, it was a candidate for an origin point, at least for some of the big ideas that later civilizations made famous. Yet the argument still wasn't finished, because you can't build a whole chronology on one date and a handful of stylistic impressions. And this is where the story starts to feel modern. In the mid-20th century, archaeology gets something like a lab coat. Radiocarbon dating becomes practical, becomes a tool scholars can use in real field contexts, becomes a way to bring time into focus, and Willard Libby's work helps make that possible. Suddenly the discipline has a new kind of evidence, not a hunch and not a vibe, but a measurement tied to physical material from the ground. It isn't perfect. It comes with error ranges. It has to be calibrated. It can be contaminated if you are careless, but it does something priceless. It forces the conversation out of pure interpretation, and it gives history a timestamp. When radiocarbon dating is applied to contexts at Venta and related sites, the results come back earlier than many scholars had been prepared to accept, and this is the point where the debate stops being a matter of taste. The dates suggest major activity in the second millennium BCE, with key Olmec phases in the range of roughly 1200 to 1000 BCE at places like Venta, and broader development stretching across centuries. Put that next to the popular story of the Maya, and you feel the ground shift. The famous classic Maya world is later, the Aztecs are much later, and suddenly you have a civilization-scale society on the Gulf Coast operating while much of the ancient world is still in what Americans would call early days. If you want an anchor, think of it like this. When Venta is thriving, classical Athens is not a thing yet, and the Roman Empire is not a thing yet. This is early, deep time for the Americas, and it is happening in a region most people picture as swamp and jungle, which is part of why it was so hard for outsiders to accept. We like our beginnings to look clean. We like them to look like stone cities on hills, but the Olmec heartland does not give you that. It gives you water and mud and green everywhere, mosquitoes and heat and rot and fertility, a world where life grows too fast, and yet a world that can feed people, support dense communities, and produce kings who want their faces carved into mountains. Once the dates landed, another old argument started to lose oxygen, and it's the one that still shows up in comment sections, the transoceanic fantasy. The idea that the heads look African, therefore Africans must have sailed here and made them. This claim has been recycled so many times it almost feels like a tradition, and it is worth addressing once, clearly, because it is not harmless. It is the same old refusal to give indigenous people credit for what they built, and it is also a misunderstanding of how art works. Monumental portraiture is not a photograph, it is a political image. It emphasizes certain traits, follows local conventions, can be stylized in ways that seem unfamiliar to outsiders, and can look different from region to region within the same culture. So the responsible question is not, what does it remind me of, but what evidence would prove foreign origin? You would want intrusive old-world artifacts in secure early layers, unmistakable foreign burials, and a consistent pattern across multiple sites, and that pattern does not exist. What does exist is a growing body of scientific work that supports local continuity, and that includes genetics. By the late 2010s, ancient DNA methods had become powerful enough to contribute to broader population history questions in the Americas, and in 2018, genetic studies helped reinforce a basic conclusion that serious scholars had already accepted from archaeology and linguistics. The people behind the Olmec civilization were indigenous to the Americas, not a colony from Africa, and not a lost Egyptian expedition, but local populations with deep roots and complex relationships to later communities in southern Mexico. When people talk about connections to Mixozoian language families, that's part of the same effort to trace continuity and influence without reaching for fantasy. Now, that does not mean genetics gives us a neat roll call of Olmec rulers or a simple, they were exactly this modern group, because human history is messier than that. Populations move, communities mix, languages spread and shift. But it does mean the old racist storyline collapses under modern evidence, and that matters. Because once you stop looking for outsiders, you can finally look at the people who are actually there and ask questions that lead somewhere. What kind of society could organize the carving of basalt? What kind of belief system makes a ruler's head worth moving 60 miles through swampy land? And what kind of political structure can feed laborers, coordinate routes, and keep a project going season after season? There is another reason this chapter matters. It shows how hard it can be to let a new civilization into the story. It is easy now to say the Olmecs are the earliest major civilization in Mesoamerica, but it was not easy to say that in 1900, not easy in 1925, and not even easy in 1939. It took decades of fieldwork, it took arguments, it took new tools, and it took, honestly, a cultural shift inside scholarship, with people willing to say, maybe our map of the past is missing a whole continent of meaning. So where are we at the end of this first chapter? We are standing in a cleared space. The wrong explanations have been pushed aside. The timeline has been pulled into focus. The Gulf Coast is no longer a blank, and the stone heads are no longer curiosities that must be explained by strangers. They are monuments made by local people who had the skill and the power to do astonishing things. And yet, even now, the Olmecs keep a certain distance. We do not have their full names in a way we can read with confidence. We do not have a long narrative text that tells us in their voice what they thought they were doing. We have fragments, symbols, offerings buried where no human was meant to see them again, and cities that rose and fell and were reclaimed by the jungle. That gap is not a failure, it's part of the atmosphere, and it's what makes the Olmecs feel like they are half in sunlight and half in shadow. We can date them, trace their influence, and see their fingerprints in later civilizations, but we still have to approach them carefully, like you approach a powerful animal in tall grass, watching and listening, following tracks, and then moving closer one careful step at a time. So that is what we do next. We step out of the argument and into the landscape itself. We go to the land of rain and rivers. We meet the so-called rubber people on their own ground, and we ask what kind of daily life and technology could grow out of heat, water, and mud. Before we talk about kings and pyramids and stone giants, we have to talk about the stage, because the Olmec story is not a mountaintop story at all. It's a lowland story that begins in heat and water, in the Gulf Coast of what is now southern Mexico, in places like modern Veracruz and Tabasco, in a landscape that can feel to an outsider like it is trying to erase you. The air stays wet, the ground stays soft, the green comes in fast and doesn't ask permission, and the mosquitoes have the confidence of an empire. In the rainy season, rivers swell and spread, and in the dry season, the sun turns the air into a slow, heavy punishment. And still, people lived here. They didn't just endure it either. They thrived, built, organized, and dreamed. And that alone is a clue, because environments like this don't reward casual visitors. They reward people who know every bend in the river, who know which plants heal and which plants kill, who can read the sky, and who can make food grow in a world that will happily drown your crops and then, a few months later, bake the same ground hard. This is where the name comes in, Olmec. It sounds ancient and official, like it came from the people themselves, but it didn't. It's a label borrowed from a later language, Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, and it comes from a word often glossed as rubber people. It's an exonym, a name given from the outside, and it's a little like calling the ancient Greeks the marble people because you met them through statues. It's not exactly wrong, it's just incomplete. The important thing is what the name points to, because it points to a material that, in the ancient world, had no obvious right to exist. Rubber, real rubber, elastic and bouncy and useful and strange. If you grew up in a world without plastic, rubber is basically magic, because it bends and stretches and seals and snaps back, doing things wood can't do, stone can't do, and leather can only kind of do, and not like that. For us, rubber is everywhere and almost invisible. For them, rubber was power, technology, trade, and probably identity. Now, here's the question that keeps the tension alive. How does a society living in swampy lowlands, without iron tools and without draft animals, become associated with a material that feels almost industrial? The answer isn't one miracle. It's a chain of small discoveries that add up to something big. It starts with trees. The rubber tree, Castilla elastica, grows in these regions, and when you cut it, it bleeds latex. Not blood, but a milky sap that sticks to your skin and smells faintly sharp, like something alive that doesn't want to be taken. If you let that latex dry on its own, you don't get a perfect rubber ball. You get something brittle, something that cracks. So the raw material isn't enough. The real secret is chemistry, and the real secret is that the Olmec world seems to have figured out a recipe. They mixed latex with juice from certain vines, often associated with morning glory, and the combination changes the material properties, turning sticky sap into usable rubber. That is a huge leap. It's not they found a cool thing, it's they engineered a cool thing, and it's closer to a lab than a campfire trick. And the wild part is how human it probably was. You can imagine someone experimenting and failing, someone getting yelled at because they ruined a batch, someone noticing that one mixture holds together and another one doesn't, someone realizing the rubber bounces differently when you change the ratio. It's ancient science, but it has the same rhythm as modern tinkering. Try, fail, adjust, try again. If you want an American anchor, think of rubber in their world the way plastic works in ours. It isn't just one product, it's a platform. It changes what is possible, letting you make things that don't exist in a purely stone and wood universe. And once it exists, it creates demand. Once you can make a rubber ball that actually bounces, people want it. Once you can make waterproof seals, people want them. Once you can make something that grips or cushions, people notice, and that demand spreads along trade routes. Which brings us back to the landscape, because the Olmec heartland is wet, yes, but wet also means rivers. Rivers are highways. They connect communities, move goods, move ideas, and carry rumors and prestige. And in a place where overland travel can be miserable, water becomes your road system. So the green hell stereotype is only half the story. The other half is fertility. The soils can be incredibly productive, and seasonal floods can renew the land the way the Nile did in ancient Egypt. Not in the exact same way, but in the same general effect. Water brings life. Water brings nutrients. Water gives you a reason to stay. And if you stay long enough, you start building systems. You start growing food at scale, planning ahead, storing surplus. Because you have to, because the weather will punish you if you don't. The Olmec diet was not glamorous, but it was powerful. Maize, beans, squash, the classic trio. Corn gives calories, beans give protein, and squash brings vitamins and fills out the diet. And together they form an agricultural engine. And once that engine runs reliably, everything else becomes possible. Specialists, artisans, priests, rulers, even big time-wasting projects like carving basalt. There's another layer here that I want you to feel, not just understand. Think of an early morning in the lowlands when the air is cooler for about 10 minutes and you can smell wet earth and rotting leaves, and you hear birds that sound like they're arguing while insects start up like a generator. Somewhere, people are already moving. Someone is grinding maize, stone on stone, a steady rasp. Someone is tending a fire. Someone is carrying water in a vessel that sweats in the humidity. And somewhere in the background, beyond the village rhythm, there is work that belongs to the elite. Work that isn't about dinner tonight, but about status, about the gods, about making something that will outlast you. The reason I'm dwelling on the environment is simple. This place shapes the Olmec imagination. When you live surrounded by water, water becomes sacred. When you live where crops rise out of mud, green becomes holy. When storms can destroy your world in an afternoon, you take the sky personally. And when jaguars move through the forest with silent confidence, you don't just fear them, you respect them, and you start to think of power in jaguar terms: quiet, sudden, absolute. The environment also shapes their engineering. In a region where stone is not everywhere under your feet, stone becomes a statement. Basalt becomes royal, and jade and greenstone become more than decoration. They become concentrated life, portable pieces of the color that dominates the landscape, like water and maize and breath trapped in mineral form. Which is why later we're going to see greenstone offered and buried and treated like it is alive. But we're not there yet. Right now, we're still asking a simpler question. Why call them rubber people? Because rubber is the first sign that this society is doing something different. It's not just farming, and it's not just surviving. It's taking the materials of the rainforest and turning them into technology. And that tells you something about mentality. These people were observers, experimenters, patient enough to take a sticky, frustrating sap and keep working it until it obeyed. And that patient mentality is going to show up again and again in the way they reshape land, in the way they carve stone, in the way they build ritual spaces where nothing is accidental. It also sets up the next mystery in our story. Because if a society can master rubber and agriculture in this landscape, then it can master something else too. It can master labor. It can master organization. It can decide that the swamp will not be the boss. And that brings us to the first great stage where Olmec power becomes hard to ignore: San Lorenzo, a place where people didn't just settle the land, they remade it. San Lorenzo doesn't announce itself the way people expect ancient cities to announce themselves. It isn't a skyline of stone towers or a cliffside citadel. It's a rise in the land, an engineered hill where nature didn't quite put one on its own. And that's the first thing you have to understand about the Olmecs. They weren't just building in the landscape, they were building the landscape, taking a world of water and soft ground and deciding it was going to hold something permanent. This is one of those moments where the scale sneaks up on you, because you can look at the Gulf Coast lowlands and think, how could anyone build a capital here? And then you realize the answer is that they didn't find a perfect place, they made one. San Lorenzo is usually placed in the early phase of Olmec power, roughly around 1400 to 900 BCE, and that's the window when it becomes one of the biggest, most influential centers in the region. If you're anchoring this in familiar time, sit with how early that is. This is centuries before classical Greece, and centuries before Rome becomes Rome. But the first mystery at San Lorenzo isn't the date. The first mystery is the ground itself. Because this place sits in a flood-prone world where rivers shift, water rises and falls, and the line between solid land and seasonal swamp is never stable. So the question becomes very simple. How do you build a center of power in a place that wants to drown you? The answer, again, is labor. And not just labor in the abstract, but earth-moving on a scale that feels almost modern. Over generations, people carried soil and clay and gravel by hand, in baskets, in loads that feel small until you start multiplying them by thousands of trips, by thousands of people, over years and decades. That's how a plateau is born, and that's how a ceremonial core rises above floodwater. It's like building Manhattan, but not on bedrock. It's building Manhattan on the edge of a marsh by piling the city up from scratch. And once you let that image settle, a second question appears. Who convinced people to do that? Because this kind of project doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen because a few neighbors felt like helping out. It requires planning and leadership. It requires someone with the authority to say, this is the work now. It also requires a social system that can feed workers while they do it. That is where San Lorenzo becomes more than a site, because it becomes evidence of a state-like society. Not a state in the modern sense with borders and paperwork, but a political order where elites can mobilize large groups, coordinate specialized labor, and concentrate resources in a single center. You can sense hierarchy in the way space is organized, with certain areas clearly meant for ritual and power, and other areas supporting the people who make that ritual possible. And you can also sense it in the art. San Lorenzo is one of the places where those basalt heads and other monuments appear in force. And this is where the human story sharpens, because a city is not just dirt and buildings, it's ambition and competition and fear. It's people trying to become unforgettable. Imagine a young man in a community near San Lorenzo, growing up hearing that the rulers are different, that they are closer to the gods, that they speak with a voice that carries weight. He watches ceremonies from a distance. He sees the best food go upward toward the center. He sees jade and greenstone flash in the hands of people who never carry baskets. Then one season, the order comes. The plateau needs more fill. The drainage channels need clearing. The central area needs to be raised again. He joins the line of workers and carries load after load under a sun that turns your shirt into a rag, until his hands blister and his shoulders ache, and he sleeps heavy and wakes up still tired, And he keeps coming back because it is not optional, because the center is building itself out of his time. That is a hard image, but it's an honest one. Monumental civilization always has a human cost, and the elites turn that payment into something that looks like sacred destiny. This is where the relationship between power and religion becomes inseparable, because in a world like this, the ruler does not just claim to be in charge, the ruler claims to be necessary. The ruler claims the floods can be managed because the gods favor the center, that the harvest will come because the rituals are done correctly, that the city is the axis of the world. And once people believe that, or once they fear the consequences of not believing it, the labor keeps flowing. San Lorenzo also tells us something quieter. It tells us the Olmecs were not only organizers, they were planners who understood water, who understood you can fight floods with height, guide water with channels, and manage land with terraces and engineered surfaces. That is not romantic, that is practical intelligence, and it is the difference between a settlement that comes and goes and a center that holds for centuries. And over time, holding becomes its own kind of power, because when you are the stable place, you become the place where people bring goods, where ideas collect, where artists can specialize because someone else is farming, where rituals grow more elaborate because there is surplus to spend on gods. There is another question that hovers over San Lorenzo, and it's the kind of question that makes history feel alive. What did it look like at its height? You can imagine the plateau as a high, dry island in a sea of green, with causeways and paths that stay passable when the surrounding ground turns soft, and the smell of wet clay after rain mixing with smoke from cooking fires out on the edges. You can imagine the central spaces kept cleaner and more controlled, and you can imagine people arriving by river carrying bundles of maize, jars, woven goods, maybe rubber, maybe greenstone, maybe something rarer. Then comes the moment they step into the ceremonial core and feel their behavior change, because the center is not just a marketplace, it is a stage, and the rulers are watching from somewhere you can't quite see. In the midst of that human movement, there is stone, dark basalt monuments that look out of place in a world of mud and wood, and that contrast is intentional. Stone says permanence. Stone says memory. Stone says, we are not like you, we will outlast you. And this is where San Lorenzo begins to lean toward the next chapter of our story. Because at some point, someone decided that power should have a face, that leadership should be carved into a single block of volcanic rock, and that the ruler's image should be so heavy that moving it would require an entire community's effort. That is not just art, that is politics, intimidation, a message you can't ignore. Yet even at San Lorenzo, the story refuses to sit still. Centers rise and centers decline, and around 900 BCE, something changes in the Olmec heartland. San Lorenzo's dominance fades, other centers begin to matter more. The reasons are still debated. Rivers shift, ecologies change, politics changes, maybe all of it at once. This is one of those places where we have to respect the unknown, because the soil keeps its secrets and the jungle grows back. But the pattern is clear enough to follow. Power moves, and when it moves, it carries its symbols with it, its rituals, its art, its obsession with stone. And that takes us to the most visually unforgettable mystery the Olmecs left behind, the giants of basalt, the heads that look like they are still listening, even after 3,000 years. The first time you see an Olmec colossal head, it doesn't feel like ancient art. It feels like someone is there. The face has weight, the expression is controlled, and the eyes don't beg for attention so much as they expect it. And the closer you get, the more the practical questions crowd out everything else. Who is this supposed to be? Why make it this big? And then the biggest question of all, how did they pull this off? Because a colossal head is not just a sculpture, it's a transport problem and a supply chain, an entire society flexing at once. We currently know of 17 colossal heads found in the Olmec heartland and nearby areas, and 17 is a strange number. It's enough to prove this is a tradition, but not enough to fully explain the tradition, especially because each head is different. The faces vary, the proportions shift, and the details of the mouth and cheeks and the shape of the helmet change from monument to monument, right down to little marks and cuts that feel personal. That's one reason many scholars read them as portraits, not generic gods or anonymous warriors, but specific rulers, which makes sense if you think about what a ruler wants. A ruler wants to be remembered, to be undeniable, to have his face survive even if his body doesn't. Now, look at the material: basalt, volcanic rock, dense and hard, capable of holding detail and also capable of punishing you for trying. If you've ever hit hard stone with hard stone, you know the feeling, that shock traveling up your arm until your hands go numb and your ears fill with a sharp ring that doesn't quite fade. Now stretch that out across hours and days, across a workshop full of people taking turns, and you start to hear what this work sounded like. Not one strike, but hundreds, thousands, stone on stone in a steady clack that feels almost metallic even without metal, dust rising and sweat darkening everything. And there is a human story inside that sound. There are specialists here, master carvers who know where to strike and where not to strike, apprentices learning patience the hard way, laborers hauling water, clearing debris, dragging tools back and forth. Above them all, there is pressure, because you don't waste basalt, you don't waste time, and you don't waste the ruler's stone. The helmets are one of the details that always pull people in. They look like protective headgear, almost practical, and that has led to debate. Are these helmets connected to the ball game, to warfare, to ceremony, to all of it at once? The honest answer is that we don't have one clean explanation that fits every head, but the helmets do something important even before you interpret them. They make the heads look like individuals in a role, like someone wearing an identity, like someone who belongs to a specific office, and that points again to politics. This is not just art for art's sake, this is power wearing a uniform. Now, it would still be impressive if the heads were carved right next to the quarry, or if basalt blocks were lying around like driftwood, but that's not the situation. The basalt comes from the Tuxtla Mountains, and that is the key logistical fact. For many of the heads, the distance from source to final site is on the order of 60 miles, sometimes more, sometimes less depending on where you start the measurement and what route you imagine, which is roughly 100 kilometers. And in the real world, it feels longer, because this is not a highway. This is swampy lowland and river crossings and mud that turns into glue after rain, and the Olmecs did not have wheeled carts, horses, oxen, or metal tools to cut easy roads through the jungle. So for a long time, the heads looked like an impossibility, and that is exactly why people reached for weird theories. Outsiders must have built them, magic must have built them, something must have built them because the local people couldn't. That is not evidence, that is disbelief, and disbelief is not a method. So what is the realistic picture? It's messy and human and brutal. First, you have to get the stone out of the quarry area, and that alone is a job. Then you have to move it down into the lowlands, and then you have to move it across water or along water, because rivers are the obvious candidates, and they can carry heavy loads if you build the right platform. One of the leading theories is that the heads, or rough blocks, were moved on massive rafts, and you don't need to repeat a catchphrase to feel what that means. Think of a raft wide enough to feel like a small dock, built from logs lashed together, rope cutting into hands while people wade waist-deep to steady the load as the whole structure shifts and flexes under tens of thousands of pounds. 20 tons is about 40,000 pounds, and you can't just set 40,000 pounds on something flimsy and hope it behaves. So the engineering is real, even if it isn't engineering in the modern math and blueprint sense. It's engineering in the field, knowing what floats and what fails, knowing how to distribute weight so you don't snap the whole thing in half. Then there's the overland part. Maybe the final approach from riverbank to ceremonial center, maybe a section where the water gets too shallow or the root doesn't reach the exact spot. So you drag, you lever, you roll, and yes, one common idea is rollers, logs under the stone, but rollers in a swamp are tricky. Logs sink, slide sideways, and the ground gives way. So it may have been more like a sledge, a platform pulled over prepared surfaces, or a combination, rollers where the ground is firm and dragging where it isn't. The truth is, we don't have a surviving instruction manual, so we infer from physics, from landscape, and from what coordinated human labor can actually do. And this is where the heads become a demonstration of political power in a way almost nothing else can. Because even if you solve the physics, you still have to solve the social problem. You need hundreds of people, maybe more, committed to one task. You need them fed and organized. You need them returning day after day. And you need someone making decisions when something goes wrong, because something always goes wrong. A rope snaps, a raft scrapes bottom, a load shifts, a storm rises, a river swells, somebody gets hurt, somebody dies. And the project continues because a ruler's monument does not wait for your grief. That sounds harsh, and it is harsh. That is the nature of state-scale labor in the ancient world, and it's why the heads feel like more than sculpture. They are frozen moments of authority, physical proof that someone could command resources at a massive scale. Now here's another detail that adds a twist. Many of the heads appear to have been carved from earlier monuments, and you can see evidence of reworking, like an older throne-like block or a different sculpture being reshaped into a head. That suggests stone was precious enough to recycle, and it also suggests politics could change fast enough that an older monument lost value. Maybe an older ruler fell out of favor. Maybe a new ruler wanted to erase him. Maybe a monument was captured and repurposed. That is where the heads start to feel almost like living participants in history. They are not just created, they are moved, altered, and sometimes damaged, and some show signs of deliberate defacement, broken noses, gouged features, marks that look like intention rather than accident. If that is true, it opens another kind of question. What kind of anger makes people attack a stone face, and what kind of revolution tries to kill a memory? We'll come back to that when we talk about collapse, but it matters here too, because it reminds you these monuments were not neutral, they weren't decoration, they were political, and they had enemies. There is one more reason the heads keep their mystery even after you explain the physics. We still do not fully agree on what exactly they were for. Portraits, yes. Rulers, likely. But why heads? Why not full bodies? Why not scenes? Why not inscriptions? Why these compressed, intense faces?
One possibility is that the head was the seat of identity, where power lived, where the soul spoke. Another possibility is practical. A head is stable and can survive, while a full statue breaks easier. But even that practical explanation circles back to meaning, because choosing what will survive is itself a statement, and that is what the Olmecs were doing. They were choosing what would last: a face, a helmet, a calm expression that refuses to explain itself. So by the time you walk away from a colossal head, you have answers and you still have questions. You can explain the stone and the distance, and you can imagine rafts and sledges and hundreds of people hauling and chanting and cursing and sweating until you almost feel rope burn in your own hands just thinking about it. But you still don't know the ruler's name. You still don't know what story he told about himself when he stood in front of that monument. You still don't know what the people thought as they watched it arrive. Pride and fear and awe all tangled together. And that tension is exactly where the next chapter lives, because a society that can make rubber bounce and stone move like this is not just building monuments for fun. It is performing power through ritual. It is turning technology into religion. And the most famous ritual technology of all in Mesoamerica is the ball game, a game that looks from far away like sport.
If you want to understand the Olmecs without turning them into a museum label, follow the sound and the rhythm of something heavy hitting the ground. That steady thud repeating until it starts to feel like a heartbeat. Somewhere in the humid air of the Gulf Coast, long before the Maya built stadiums and long before the Aztecs turned rituals into imperial theater, people were already gathering around a simple, brutal idea. A bouncing ball, a game, and underneath the game, a story about how the universe works. The oldest solid evidence we have for the Mesoamerican ball game shows up early, and it shows up in a way that fits the Olmec world almost too perfectly. At a place called El Manati, archaeologists found rubber balls dated to around 1600 BCE, and that date matters because it pushes the tradition deep into the Olmec horizon while matching what we already know about the region. These are the people living in the land of latex. These are the people who figured out how to turn sticky sap into true rubber. So the ball game is not an add-on to their culture, it's almost a signature, the moment where chemistry becomes public spectacle. Now, if you've only seen the ball game in documentaries about the Maya, you might picture stone rings and a court that looks like an arena, but that classic image is later and more formal. Early on, courts could be simpler, the rules could vary, and yet the core idea stays remarkably consistent. The ball is heavy. It can be the size of a human head, and it can weigh several pounds, with some estimates putting game balls at up to around 9 pounds, about 4 kilograms. That is not a soccer ball. That is closer to a medicine ball that wants to bruise you. And you're not allowed to use your hands the way your instincts beg you to. So players use hips and thighs and shoulders, sometimes special padded gear, and they learn to redirect that weight with precision. It's athletic and painful, and it's weirdly elegant when you see it done well. Now think about learning it from scratch, and think about the first time a young player takes the ball off the hip wrong. It hits bone. The shock shoots through your body. The bruise blooms dark and ugly by evening. You wake up sore, and you go back anyway, because this is not just recreation. This is a path, an honor, a kind of belonging, and in some communities, it is also proximity to the sacred. Because what looks like sport from a distance is also ritual choreography, a drama people understood in cosmic terms: light versus darkness, order versus chaos, life versus death. A ball moving between two sides starts to resemble the sun's motion through the sky, or the moon, or a planet, or even a heart, and the game becomes a model of the universe. Once you start thinking that way, the court is no longer just a court.
It's a stage built into the earth, a place where the invisible world and the human world can touch. That's the mood you need for the next part, because the ball game doesn't belong only to athletes. It belongs to rulers and priests. It belongs to crowds. It belongs to the gods. The Olmecs don't leave us a neat rule book, so we have to be careful with the most dramatic claim people like to make. We can't say every match ended in sacrifice. We can't say the winners always died, and we can't say the losers always died either. But we can say something stronger and more accurate. The ball game sits in the same cultural space as blood and offering, in the same space as decapitation imagery that appears later in Mesoamerican art, and in the same space as the idea that renewal requires payment, that the world keeps going because somebody gives something up. So yes, sacrifice becomes part of the ball game tradition in many later societies, and the imagery of severed heads especially becomes hard to ignore, which creates that unsettling ambiguity people always talk about. Were the losers sacrificed as punishment? Were the winners sacrificed as an honor? Did it depend on the occasion? Did it depend on the political message the ruler wanted that day?
The most honest answer is that it probably varied, because ritual systems are not always consistent. They respond to politics, they adapt, they serve power. But the important point for our story is simpler. The ball game was never just a game. It was a public ritual where bodies took risks in front of the community, and those risks carried meaning. Now, let me drop the tension for a second and make a human connection, because otherwise this gets too heavy too fast. Every time I read about sacrifice in the ball game tradition, I think about modern sports fans, and I think about how intense people get over football, how rivalries can turn normal adults into temporary lunatics, and I can't help it. I know some football fans who would love for the old tradition to continue, at least for the rival team. You know exactly the type I mean, the guy who says we should fire everyone after one bad quarter, the guy who treats a scoreboard like it's moral truth. Obviously, we are not bringing sacrifice back, but the joke points to something real. Sports have always been a socially safe way to channel dangerous emotions, aggression and pride and fear and loyalty, and the ball game did that too. The difference is that in the ancient world, the line between sport and religion was thin, and sometimes it disappeared. There's another angle here that matters for the Olmecs in particular. Rubber is not just a material. It changes the physics of play. A rubber ball bounces and moves unpredictably, accelerating and dropping in ways a stone or wooden ball doesn't. And that unpredictability creates suspense. The crowd can't fully predict the next moment. The players can't either. And that's perfect for ritual, because ritual thrives on controlled chaos and on the feeling that something could go wrong, that the gods are paying attention. The ball game also ties the Olmecs into the larger Mesoamerican story in a way almost nothing else does. You can trace a line from early rubber balls in watery offering places like El Manati to later ball courts with stone architecture. And you can trace another line from early symbolism to later myth, and you can feel continuity across centuries. And when people call the Olmecs a mother culture, this is one of the reasons, not because they invented every single detail of Mesoamerica, but because they are early in creating a shared vocabulary, a shared set of ritual habits, and a shared sense that politics and sacred drama belong together. So when you hear rubber people, don't hear it as a cute nickname, hear it as a clue. Rubber was technology, yes, and rubber was trade, yes, but rubber also became ritual, the heart of a game that taught communities how to think about life and death,
It taught them that the universe is a contest that never stops, that motion itself can be sacred, and that spectacle is a form of control, because if you can make a whole population gather and hold its breath over a ball, you can make it hold its breath over almost anything. And once you understand how ritual performance works, you start seeing it everywhere, in carvings and offerings and strange half-human, half-animal figures that look like they're caught between worlds. The Olmecs did not separate politics from religion, they fused them, and their gods or their spirits often wore jaguar skin.
At some point, every civilization tells you what it fears, what it worships, and what it thinks power actually is. For the Olmecs, power is not polite or clean or distant. It's wet and hungry and alive in the forest, the kind of power that moves without warning and the kind you feel more than you see. And if you grew up in the Gulf Coast lowlands, you didn't have to imagine that power because you heard it at night, in the brush, and in the sudden silence that falls when animals stop making noise. You heard it in the one sound that tells you a predator is close: the jaguar. In the Olmec world, the jaguar is not just an animal. It's a symbol that keeps showing up like a recurring dream, and the details repeat in your mind: claws, spots, fangs, a heavy head, a body built for ambush. On one level, it makes perfect sense. Jaguars were real, they were dangerous, and they were the top of the food chain in that environment. But the Olmec jaguar becomes more than wildlife. It becomes a model for authority, quiet and absolute. And that's where religion starts to blend with politics. Because if a ruler wants to feel inevitable, he doesn't dress like a farmer. He aligns himself with the thing that makes farmers go silent. Now here's the tricky part. The Olmecs did not leave us a clear, readable theology the way later religions do. So we aren't holding an Olmec Bible, and we aren't reading sermons in their own words. We work with images, with rituals inferred from deposits and offerings, with symbols carved into stone and jade, which means we have to separate what we can say with confidence from what we can only suggest. Even with that caution, a pattern comes through. The Olmec sacred world is a world of transformation, human to animal, animal to human, and something in between that moves across the boundary like it owns both sides. This is where shamanism enters the conversation. Not shamanism as a vague word for mystical, but shamanism as a social role. A specialist who claims they can travel, negotiate with spirits, take on another form in a ritual sense, and return with knowledge. And if you want to visualize that, it helps to avoid the cartoon version. Don't picture a wizard in a costume. Think of a respected person in the community with training, someone who knows plants and poisons and prayers, someone who can look at a sick child and tell you whether this is a fever that will pass or a sickness that needs an offering. In a world without modern medicine, that skill is not optional, and it becomes sacred almost by default. The forest, of course, provides tools that make altered states possible. Tobacco is one of them, and it can hit the body hard when used in strong forms. Other psychoactive substances exist in the broader region too, and people often talk about bufo toads in later contexts and about different plant hallucinogens across Mesoamerica. With the Olmecs, we have to speak cautiously about exact recipes and exact rituals, but the general point still stands. Altered consciousness was part of ritual life for many societies in this zone, and altered consciousness
fits the Olmec obsession with transformation, because if you feel yourself leave your normal mind, the idea of turning into a jaguar stops being just metaphor and starts feeling like an event. Now we get to one of the most famous and most unsettling images in Olmec art, the Were-Jaguar. You see figures that look like infants or young beings with jaguar traits, with downturned mouths and heavy eyelids and a kind of blank trance-like expression, sometimes a cleft in the head, sometimes a body that looks human but not fully. People have argued about what this means for decades, and the arguments tell you as much about us as they do about them. One interpretation is mythic, the idea that a jaguar and a woman produce a supernatural child, a boundary-breaking being that mixes fertility and danger.
Another interpretation is shamanic, where the Were-Jaguar is not a literal hybrid child, but a visual language for transformation, a human in the process of becoming something else, a priest becoming an animal, or an elite claiming animal power. Another interpretation is medical, and it is uncomfortable. Some scholars have suggested that certain physical traits in the imagery resemble congenital conditions, a cleft lip, certain cranial forms, spinal issues. And if that is true, then the image might be tied to real children who looked different, children who were interpreted as special, marked by the gods, feared, revered, and used as symbols. We have to admit something here. We don't know which interpretation is the answer, and we might be dealing with more than one meaning at once, because a myth can overlap with a ritual role, and a ritual role can overlap with real human bodies, and symbolic art can compress all of that into a single face. That is what symbolic systems do. They stack meanings, and they don't always explain themselves. Now, I want to make this personal for a second, because this is where history becomes human and not just spooky art. Imagine a mother in an Olmec community, in heat that makes the baby cry easily and makes the mother's arms stick to the child's skin, with the smell of smoke and wet earth hanging in the air. The baby is born with something different about their face, maybe a cleft, maybe a shape that draws attention, and the mother feels that punch of fear that comes when something breaks expectation. Then the community reacts. A midwife whispers. An elder watches closely. Someone says, the gods touched this child. Someone says, the spirits did. Suddenly, the baby is not only a baby, the baby becomes a sign, and the mother is caught between love and ritual, between protection and pressure. That is a real kind of tension, because ancient religion is not only temples and sacrifices, it is also mothers and children, and the way a community interprets a body. The Olmec elite world adds another human layer, body modification. Cranial shaping is known in later Mesoamerican societies, and it appears in early contexts too, and the idea is brutal and simple. You bind an infant's head to shape it over time. The baby cries and the parent flinches, but the parent continues because the community has decided that looking a certain way signals status or beauty or closeness to the sacred. That is not barbaric. It is social logic pushed to an extreme, and we do versions of it now with different tools. The Olmecs were not aliens. They were people, and they paid prices to belong. When you step back from the Were-Jaguar and the trance and the fear, you notice another constant: green stone, jade and jade-like green stones. The color is the point. Green is life, maize in the field, the world after rain, the riverbanks where everything grows, and in a place where death is always close,
Life becomes the most valuable material you can hold in your hand. That is why jade matters more than gold here. Gold doesn't grow. Gold doesn't feed you. Gold doesn't look like the world when it is alive. Jade does. So jade becomes sacred technology, a portable piece of fertility, a way to carry the color of renewal into a ritual space, which is why Olmec people carve it into masks and figures, polish it until it glows in low light, and bury it as offerings. They are not just decorating, they are paying. They are negotiating with forces they believe control rain, harvest, birth, and death. And once you see that, Olmec religion stops feeling like a collection of strange monsters and starts feeling like a system built for a specific landscape, a landscape where water is everything, predators are real, storms can wipe out months of work, and the boundary between life and decay is thin because rot is always happening right next to growth. In that world, the most logical religion is one that treats transformation as normal, where humans can become animals, gods can be half this and half that, and caves and mouths and openings matter because they are doors between realms. And that sets us up for the next place in our journey, because after San Lorenzo fades, another center rises that seems built almost as a sacred diagram, Venta, with its great mound, with its buried offerings, with gifts placed in the earth and then sealed away, as if the earth itself is the audience.
If San Lorenzo feels like raw power learning how to stand on dry ground, Venta feels like power learning how to speak in symbols. It rises after San Lorenzo's dominance fades, roughly in the window around 900 to 400 BCE, and it does it in a place that still looks, at first glance, like the wrong setting for a ceremonial capital. The air is wet and the ground is soft, the horizon is mostly green, and the sky can go from bright to violent in a single afternoon. And yet, in the middle of that, Venta becomes a planned, sacred landscape, like somebody looked at the messy rainforest world and decided to draw order onto it. When you come toward the site in your imagination, it helps to let go of the usual picture of stone walls, because this is a lowland center built out of earth and clay, where mounds and platforms rise above the flat terrain like islands, and the smell of damp soil after rain seems to sit in the air while your shoes sink a little with every step. And then there's that moment where you realize one of those mounds isn't just a mound. It's a pyramid in function, even if it isn't the clean, angular stone shape most Americans picture when they hear the word pyramid. Venta's Great Mound is often described as one of the earliest monumental pyramidal constructions in Mesoamerica, built mostly from packed earth and clay, and it has this volcanic silhouette that almost looks like a man-made mountain in miniature. In a flat, watery world, height is drama, height is control, and height is the feeling that someone can bring the sky down closer. Now you might ask, why build a pyramid out of clay in a place where rain can turn clay into a mess? And that question is exactly the point. Building something like that means constant maintenance, constant labor, constant attention. So this is not a casual religious site. It's a power center with a ritual schedule, a place where leaders can pull people in season after season and keep them working and keep them watching. And just like with San Lorenzo, the real mystery isn't that they could pile up dirt. The mystery is that they could organize a society to do it, to repeat it, and to treat it as sacred work rather than just exhausting work. But Venta isn't famous only because it's big. It's famous because it's strange in a very specific way, because this is where you start seeing offerings that feel almost theatrical, except the theater is aimed at the earth, not at the crowd.
The Olmecs at Venta created massive offerings that were never meant to be displayed. They dug deep pits and arranged materials with care, laying out patterns and placing mosaics made from green stone, often serpentine, fitted together like a giant design you would expect to be shown off. And then they buried it. They covered it up. They sealed it away. No audience, no applause, no "look what we made," just the earth closing over it like a door. That is one of those moments where you can feel the distance between their mindset and ours, because our instinct is to show, while their instinct, at least in this ritual context, was to hide. That turns the offering into a message not to people, but to forces under the ground, to the land itself, to the gods of water and fertility and the underworld. And it's like writing a letter and then immediately locking it in a vault, because the only reader that matters is not human. Once you let that sink in, the whole site feels different. Venta is not just a place for ceremonies above ground, it is also a place where meaning is planted underground, like seeds. Which raises the next question: what kind of belief system makes secrecy holy?
One answer is that the act matters more than the display. Another answer is that these were payments, not performances, because they weren't trying to impress the neighbors, they were trying to keep the world running. They were negotiating. And negotiation implies risk. It implies you think something might go wrong if you don't do this properly. That's the tension that runs under Venta, and it makes the site feel like a place built on a bargain with nature. The artifacts at Venta also give us some of the clearest images of Olmec ideology. One famous monument, often called Altar 4, shows a figure emerging from a niche or a cave-like opening, holding what look like ropes or bands that extend outward. And the image hits hard because it can be read in more than one way. It can be a ruler emerging from the underworld and claiming divine legitimacy. It can be a shaman stepping between realms. It can be a leader literally holding authority, like reins, like he is pulling power toward himself. And caves matter in Mesoamerican thought for a reason. Caves are mouths in the earth. They are entrances. They are places where water comes from. They are places where the underworld feels close. So when you see a ruler framed by an opening like that, you're seeing a political statement dressed as cosmology. Someone saying, "My power comes from where life and death come from." Now, here's the part I want you to feel in your body. Think about the labor behind one of those buried offerings. It's hot. Your shirt sticks to you. You're hauling heavy green stone pieces slick with humidity. They clink when they touch, and you're lowering them into a pit while someone directs placement carefully, not roughly, carefully, because the pattern matters and it has to be right. You don't rush a gift to the gods. Then the moment comes when the design is complete. It's beautiful. It's also temporary in the weirdest way, because the next step is to bury it. So you cover it with soil, tamp it down, watch the green disappear, and feel the earth take it. And for the rest of your life, you walk over that spot knowing it's down there, unseen, like a secret under your feet. That's a very different relationship to art than we usually have, and it's almost hypnotic. But it's also deeply revealing because it suggests a society where the most important audience is invisible, which makes rulers and priests even more powerful. Because if they claim to understand the invisible audience, they can claim to be necessary. Venta also forces us to embrace what we don't know. We don't know the full calendar of rituals performed there. We don't know the exact words spoken during offerings. We don't know what music sounded like in the ceremonial spaces, even though we can almost hear it in our imagination. Drums echoing in wet air, and voices rising and falling with the rhythm of work. We don't know whether people experienced these ceremonies as comfort or fear, or both. But we can say this: Venta represents a mature phase of Olmec civilization. It represents a world where engineering, religion, and political authority are fused into a single machine. Earthworks are not just architecture, they are sacred geometry. Offerings are not just gifts, they are contracts. Art is not just decoration, it is ideology you can touch. And if you've been wondering where later civilizations of Mesoamerica get their taste for grand ceremonial centers, for pyramids, for public ritual mixed with deep secrecy, Venta is one of the places where that taste becomes unmistakable. But it also sets up the next tension in our story, because once you see how much the Olmecs shaped the symbolic vocabulary of the region, you have to ask a dangerous question. Were they the mother culture who taught everyone else? Or were they one powerful voice in a larger chorus of early Mesoamerican societies, all inventing and borrowing and competing at the same time? That debate is where we go next. By the time you reach Venta in your mind, the temptation is almost automatic. You want a single origin story, one culture to be the spark, the Olmecs as the first draft of everything that comes later. And honestly, a lot of older scholarship leaned that way. People called the Olmecs the mother culture of Mesoamerica, and it's a powerful phrase, but it's also a risky one, because it can turn history into a simple family tree, and real history is rarely that neat. So here's the question we have to hold without crushing it. Did the Olmecs invent the big cultural toolkit and pass it down, or were they one early powerhouse in a region where multiple societies were growing, experimenting, borrowing, and competing at the same time? That second model is often called the sister culture idea. It says Olmec influence is real, but it's part of a wider conversation, and the truth is there are good historians on both sides of this debate. The difference often comes down to how you read influence and how comfortable you are with uncertainty. Let's start with why mother culture became so attractive. The Olmec heartland is early, the monuments are early, the level of organization is early, and Olmec-style imagery shows up far beyond the Gulf Coast. Motifs travel, certain iconography repeats in other regions. Elite objects appear that look like they belong to a shared visual language, and it's hard not to conclude that something important is starting here. The Olmecs also seem to be early in building the things later civilizations make famous: monumental ceremonial centers, formalized ritual spaces, ruler imagery tied to supernatural legitimacy, the ball game tradition, the obsession with greenstone, the jaguar, the idea that the landscape itself can be engineered into sacred geometry. If you squint, it can feel like a blueprint. And that blueprint language is exactly why people reach for the mother metaphor. But then the counter-argument walks in, and it's a fair one. Mesoamerica is not an empty stage waiting for one actor. It's a densely interactive world with multiple regions, their own ecologies, their own pressures, and communities developing agriculture at different tempos. It has trade networks that move materials and styles in more than one direction, and it has local inventions that can look similar because humans solve similar problems in similar ways. So the sister culture model says this: the Olmecs were not the only early innovators. They were among the first, among the most influential, but they were not alone, and they were part of a broader early florescence that includes societies like the Zapotecs and others. In that model, Olmec style becomes less like a stamp of ownership and more like a regional fashion of power, a shared elite language that different groups speak for their own reasons. That brings us to one of the most sensitive topics in this debate: writing. Because if you can prove early writing, you can argue for early statecraft, early administration, early calendar systems.
And calendars and writing are exactly the kinds of things people love to assign a first to. The Olmecs give us a few pieces of evidence that keep the conversation alive, and one of the most famous is the Cascajal block, a stone block with a sequence of signs carved on it. It looks like a text. It looks intentional. It looks like someone is repeating and organizing symbols the way writing systems do. If it really is writing, it would be a big deal, suggesting that in or near the Olmec world, people were developing a true script earlier than we used to assume. But here's the honest part. The Cascajal block is also controversial, not because it's fake in some easy sense, but because early writing is hard to prove from a single object. We don't have stacks of Olmec books. We don't have long inscriptions we can cross-compare and translate. We have tantalizing fragments, and fragments can tease you. So the responsible position is cautious excitement. It might be writing. It might be a kind of proto-writing. It might be a ritual sign system that behaves like writing without being full phonetic text. The point is not to win an argument in one sentence.
The point is to see how close the Olmec world gets to the threshold. Now let's talk about timekeeping. Mesoamerica is famous for calendrical thinking, for long counts and cycles and dates carved into stone, and the Maya are the celebrity here, while the Olmecs show up in the background like the opening act people ignored at first. We already talked about Stela C and its long count date, often read as landing around 31 BCE under common correlations, and that monument becomes a pressure point for one reason. It suggests that the machinery of calendrical notation might be present outside the Maya heartland, and that the concept of recording deep time could have roots in earlier traditions. But there's a catch. Stela C is often discussed in connection with the Epi-Olmec world as well, which is part of the transition after the classic Olmec horizon. So what do we do with that? We do what good historians do. We treat it as evidence of continuity and development. We don't force it to prove more than it proves. We let it show a corridor of ideas, and that corridor likely runs through the Gulf Coast in a serious way. Then there's mathematics. People love to talk about the number 0 in Mesoamerica, and the Maya get the glory, but the broader region shows that sophisticated counting and calendrical calculation is not limited to one culture. It's part of an intellectual atmosphere. So when people say the Olmecs had 0 first, the safest way to put it is this. The conceptual groundwork for later Mesoamerican mathematics and calendrical systems seems to be developing early in the Gulf Coast sphere. The evidence is suggestive rather than absolute, and the influence is real even if the exact firsts are hard to pin down. That may sound like hedging, but it's not. It's accuracy. Because first is usually the least interesting question. How did it spread is usually the better one. And the Olmec world sits in a perfect position for spreading, connected by rivers, connected by trade, connected by prestige goods, connected by the kind of religious and political theater other elites would want to copy. So maybe the best way to frame the mother versus sister debate is not as a fight over credit, it's a fight over model. Do we imagine one core and many satellites, or do we imagine several cores trading sparks? The answer might even change depending on what part of culture you're talking about. Monumental art might diffuse one way, agricultural techniques might diffuse another way, religious motifs might spread through marriage alliances and elite exchange rather than conquest. There's room for multiple flows at once. But here's the part I don't want to lose. Even if you choose the sister culture model, the Olmecs still matter immensely because their influence is not subtle. Their visual language shows up again and again in later Mesoamerica. Their idea of rulership as sacred performance becomes a regional habit. Their comfort with massive labor projects becomes a precedent.
Their relationship with jaguar power, greenstone, and hidden offerings becomes part of the larger spiritual vocabulary. So whether you call them mother culture or you call them an early sister in a powerful family, the conclusion is the same in practice. They shaped the world that followed. The easiest American analogy isn't perfect, but it helps. Think of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Greece did not invent everything, and Rome did not simply copy everything, but Greek ideas and styles became foundational in the Roman world. Influence can be decisive without being exclusive, and that's the space the Olmecs occupy. And once you see that, the next question gets sharper. If their influence is everywhere, why did their own classic centers fade? Why do we stop seeing the Olmec world in its peak form, and what happened to the people who built San Lorenzo and Venta? That's where the story turns darker, because the end of a civilization rarely arrives with a clean explanation. It arrives like weather, like politics, like a slow unraveling that only looks obvious in hindsight.
There's a particular kind of silence that hangs over abandoned places in the tropics. In dry landscapes, ruins can sit out in the open like bones. But in the Gulf Coast lowlands, the jungle doesn't allow that. It grows over everything, fills cracks, pulls vines across stone, turns walls into bumps and plazas into clearings that look natural until you step on something that shouldn't be there. And that is part of why the end of the Olmecs feels so haunting. Their world doesn't end with a single dramatic last stand we can point to on a calendar. It ends the way many real civilizations end, through change and pressure, through a chain of problems that don't respect human pride. So the question sounds simple: why did they vanish? The honest answer is complicated, and it's also one of those moments where it's better to admit what we don't know than to pretend we do. We can outline the leading theories, weigh the clues, and build the most plausible story, but we should still respect the fog, because the Olmecs did not leave us a final letter explaining themselves. They left patterns, scars in stone, cities that stopped being maintained, and monuments that were moved, broken, and sometimes buried, as if someone wanted them gone. Start with the land. The Gulf Coast lowlands are fertile, but they are also unstable, and rivers here are both highways and threats. They flood, shift channels, deposit silt, abandon old courses, and over generations those changes can choke a port, drown a field, or isolate a center from the roots that fed it. So one major theory is environmental. River systems changed, drainage patterns shifted, fields that once produced surplus became harder to manage, sedimentation altered wetlands, and the carefully engineered balance between settlement and floodwater got thrown off. If your power depends on controlling a landscape, and the landscape changes the rules, your power starts to look less inevitable. Now layer on volcanic activity. The Tuxtla region is volcanic, and the broader Mesoamerican world lives with volcanoes the way Californians live with earthquakes. Most days you ignore it, and then the earth reminds you who's in charge. We don't have a single smoking crater we can neatly tie to the day the Olmecs fell. But volcanic events can do a lot without leaving a clean headline for archaeologists. Ash can damage crops, climate can shift locally for seasons, people can migrate, trade routes can be disrupted, and fear can spread. And in a society where rulers claim supernatural control, natural disaster is not only a practical problem, it becomes a political problem, because people start asking dangerous questions. Are the gods still with you? Did you break the bargain? Did you fail to pay? That leads directly into a third theory, and it's the one that feels the most personal: internal conflict, political upheaval. In plain language, people got tired of somebody. We have hints of this in the treatment of monuments.
Some colossal heads show signs of intentional damage, not weathering and not random accidents, but deliberate blows, features smashed, faces scarred. Some heads also appear to have been moved and reburied, which suggests that at some point someone wanted these images neutralized, not just removed, neutralized, like the monument had power that needed to be shut down. That is a very human behavior. You see it in later revolutions, when statues come down, when regimes collapse, and the first thing people do is attack the symbols. We can't time travel and watch the scene, but you can imagine the atmosphere. A crowd in hot air, shouting, rope thrown around stone, people pulling until the monument tips and the face cracks when it hits. Not because they hate art, but because they hate what the art represents. The memory of command, the years of forced labor, the sacred authority that made resistance feel like blasphemy. If something like that happened, it would suggest that at least part of the Olmec collapse was political, with elites losing legitimacy, new factions rising, and old rulers being erased. Another possibility is that collapse is the wrong emotional word, because the people did not disappear into smoke, and they did not go extinct as a population. What seems to happen over time is transformation. Centers shift, styles change, networks reorganize, and the classic Olmec horizon gives way to what scholars sometimes call epi-Olmec phases in the region. Other cultural forms rise. The Maya world develops in its own directions. Zapotec centers grow in Oaxaca. The Gulf Coast remains populated, but the particular Olmec combination of symbols, monumental style, and political structure changes, dissolving into new identities. And it's a bit like watching a language change over centuries. The speakers are still there, but the grammar shifts, the accent shifts, and the old form becomes an ancestor rather than a living tongue. That kind of ending is harder to dramatize, but it is often the truest. So why does it feel like a disappearance? Because the signatures fade. The colossal heads stop being made in the same way. The great ceremonial centers stop being maintained at the same scale. The ritual vocabulary moves into new hands. And the jumble does what it always does. It closes the curtain. There is a line here that captures the mood without pretending we have certainty. The Olmecs did not fall off the edge of the world, they slipped into it. They became part of the background of later Mesoamerican history, and their descendants and neighbors carried forward pieces of their knowledge, their symbolism, their technologies, and their ways of organizing life. But the name Olmec, the classic heartland pattern, the sense of a single coherent civilization, that begins to blur. And that blur is where archaeologists live, because the evidence is real, but the story has to be carefully reconstructed. If you want one image to hold on to this. A stone head, once upright and dominant, is now partly buried, vines crawling over it, rain filling the grooves. The face is still calm, but the world that made it is gone. The city that commanded it is quiet. The labor that moved it has ended. And somewhere nearby, people are still living their lives, planting maize, raising children, making offerings, speaking languages that will evolve, adapting to new powers and new alliances. History doesn't always end with an explosion. Sometimes it ends with a shift in the river, sometimes with a failed harvest, sometimes with a statue pulled down at dusk, and sometimes with a culture becoming so influential that it doesn't need to exist as itself anymore. It becomes the soil other civilizations grow in. That is the final paradox of the Olmecs. Their cities faded, but their ideas did not. And that takes us to the last thing we need to do. Step back, look at the long shadow, and ask what, exactly, they left behind. Because even if you have never heard the word Olmec before today, you have probably seen their legacy without knowing it, in pyramids and jaguars and jade and the ball game, and in the very idea that a ruler can make the earth itself into a sacred stage.
When people ask what the Olmecs left behind, it's tempting to answer with a list. Pyramids, stone heads, jaguars, jade, the ball game, cornfields, calendars. And yes, all of that is true, but lists don't really capture what makes this civilization feel important. Because the deepest legacy of the Olmecs isn't one invention, it's a habit of thinking, a way of organizing the world, and maybe even a moment in Mesoamerican history when power starts to look like something you can build into the landscape, carve into stone, and perform in public until it begins to feel like nature. The Olmec heartland was not a place outsiders expected to produce a first. It was hot, wet, tangled, and, in the old colonial language, the kind of environment people called impossible, which is exactly why their success matters. They proved that complexity does not need mountains and marble. It can rise out of mud and rivers, out of a world where life grows too fast and death is always nearby. They also set a tone for what comes later in Mesoamerica. The pyramid, even in its early earthen form, becomes a stage for connecting sky and earth. The ball game becomes a ritual drama that later civilizations refine and monumentalize. Jaguar power becomes a political metaphor that survives for centuries. Jade and greenstone become sacred material not because they're shiny, but because they carry the color of water and maize and renewal. And the practice of burying offerings, giving beauty to the earth and sealing it away, becomes part of a long tradition of treating the underworld as a real audience. If you take one idea from this story, take this one. The Maya and the Aztecs did not appear from nowhere. Their temples and calendars and mythologies have deep roots, and some of those roots run straight through the Gulf Coast lowlands. Not because the Olmecs were the only innovators, and not because everyone else was just copying, but because the Olmecs were early, powerful, and influential in shaping a shared vocabulary of sacred kingship and monumental ritual life. So the next time you see a picture of a Maya pyramid, or a carved stela with a date, or a jaguar figure staring out from a museum case, it's worth pausing for a second and remembering that some of the earliest experiments in this whole Mesoamerican world were happening in the humid lowlands of Veracruz and Tabasco, in places where the air sticks to your skin, where rivers are roads, where rubber trees bleed latex, and somebody, a long time ago, figured out how to turn that sap into technology. And then, after building cities and monuments that still feel impossible, they slipped back into the jungle, leaving behind faces of basalt that keep their calm expression no matter what century you stand in. That's the strange beauty of the Olmecs. They're both foundational and distant, both visible and half-hidden, a civilization we can date and map, but still not fully hear. And maybe that's why they hold on to us, because they remind us that the past is not a neat story with a beginning and an end. It's a landscape, it's layered, it's alive, and sometimes, if you walk far enough into the green, it looks back at you. Thanks for watching. If you want more deep history like this, you know what to do. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.